For the last few sections, we have looked at a number of different entity types, such as dimensional tables, fact tables, and aggregate tables. In this section, we will discuss how entities are related to each other by means of what is known as an entity relationship diagram, ER diagrams, also abbreviated to ERD. As discussed with normalization of tables, we look to separate repeating groups of data into their own separate dimensional tables. We demonstrated the use of primary keys and foreign keys between such tables. And now we will address how to depict a relationship between two such entities. While there are a number of notations available for describing entities between tables, I will discuss here the crow's feet notation. In the diagram below, you will note that the entity is denoted as a rectangle, where the relationship is described as a connecting line between two entities. There are four main types of relationships that can be described between two entities. For now, though, we will only show one entity and how to describe the various types of relationships we can have with an entity. For example, to denote a 0-to-1 relationship entity, we first draw a line to the entity, and where the relationship line meets the entity, we draw a circle followed by a vertical line to denote a 0-to-1 relationship. Sometimes you will also see the entity relationship written out in shorthand by means of a 0 followed by 3 dots followed by a 1. Next, we have a 1-to-1 relationship, which is represented by two parallel lines where the relationship line joins to the entity. Moving on, we have the 0-to-many relationship, which is denoted by a 0 followed by a three-pronged crow's foot, which is where we get the name crow's feet notation as described by the many relationship. And finally, we have a 1-to-many relationship, where we have a single vertical line followed by a crow's foot. Now let's look at a few actual examples taken from the entity relationship diagrams for the SQL database, which we will be using as part of our SQL coding later on in this course. The SQL database is made up of three main entity groups, namely the customer details, the payment details, and the video details. For illustration purposes, I will only focus on the customer details section, which contains the entities customer, address, city, and country. These entities have been normalized to third normal form. During design of a database, we typically talk about entities, while when we move into the actual database physical implementation, we start referring to entities as actual tables. Hence, you will often hear the term entity and table used interchangeably in conversation. To start with, we will look at the customer and address entity relationship. Note that the crow's feet notation is denoted on each end of the relationship between the two given entities, which means we can describe the relationship between two entities in the direction an entity is joining to another entity. For the relationship from customer to address, we can observe that there is a 1-to-1 relationship as denoted by the two single bars alongside the address entity. We read this as, for any customer there can only be one address. If we now turn around and look at the entity relationship from address to customer, we can see that the entity relationship next to customer is denoted as a 1-to-many relationship and is read as one address can have many customers. Moving on to the next example between address and city, the entity relationship from address to city is a 1-to-1 relationship, read as for any address there can only be one city. Reviewing the relationship in the reverse direction from city to address, we can say that a city can have many addresses. For our last example, we review the entity relationship between city and country. We can see that the relationship between a city to a country is a one-to-one relationship, and in the opposite direction from country to city, we read this as a country can have many cities. Remember that when describing an entity relationship, we place the crow's foot notation at the destination of the entity. Hence, for our first example of describing the entity relationship between customer and address, where a customer can only have one address, place the crow's foot notation of 2 parallel bars at the destination, which is the address. This can be a little confusing to start with, as we are having to describe relationships in 2 given directions. So take your time to review each relationship as you build out your entity relationship diagrams, and this should become easier in time with more practice. Being able to describe such entity relationships enforces the rules of how data is stored in our database tables. This will become even more apparent when we move into SQL coding, as if we try to force an entity relationship that does not meet the rules of our table design, this will throw an exception error. For example, if we try to add a second address for a customer into the address table, this will throw up a violation error, saying that we can only have one address for any given customer in a table. However, if it was the case that a customer should have many addresses or could have many addresses, we need to identify this in the design stage before moving on with any physical implementation in a database. You will find entity relationship diagrams are commonplace across a number of different teams, such as the database administrators, data analysts, as well as software developers, as they show the general rules of how data interacts between any 2 given entities in our application. That's it for entity relationships in this section, and as discussed earlier, we will see a lot more of entity relationship diagrams when we move into our SQL coding section.